I'm Barb Miller, MLA for Red Deer South and Chair of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta Standing Committee on the Fund. We are pleased to be holding this meeting in the Federal Building in Edmonton, Alberta for the first time. Now to the business at hand. The Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund is a large part of a better Alberta for tomorrow. The fund earned a net income of $1.7 billion for the year ended March 31st, 2015. We are here today to discuss the status of the fund, what lies ahead for 2016, and how the fund will continue to provide a brighter future for our province in the years to come. I'd like to begin the meeting by introducing the rest of your panel. Let's start with the members of the Standing Committee. To my right, I have Chris Nielsen, MLA, Edmonton Decore, Deputy Chair of this committee, Marie Renaud, MLA for St. Albert, Wes Taylor, MLA, Battle River Wainwright.
Yeah, Wainwright.
Dr. Bob Turner, MLA for Edmonton Whitemud. And to my left, I've got Scott Sear, MLA, Bonnyville Cold Lake, Graham Sucha, MLA Calgary Shaw, Annie McKittrick, MLA for Sherwood Park. We are the Standing Committee on the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund, an all-party committee of the Legislative Assembly. In a nutshell, we review and approve the performance of the fund and report back to Albertans and the Legislative Assembly. The President of the Treasury Board and Minister of Finance is ultimately responsible for the fund and its investments. The department looks after setting the fund's long-term strategy, developing its investment policies, and monitoring the performance of its investments. Joining us on the panel from Alberta Treasury Board and Finance are Lowell Epp, the Deputy Minister of Treasury and Risk Management, Rob Babineau, Manager, Portfolio Analysis, Capital Markets, and Steve Thompson, Executive Director, Capital Markets. The Alberta Investment Management Corporation, or AIMCO, is responsible for making and managing investments in stocks, bonds, and other investment instruments within the fund's portfolio. Joining us from AIMCO are Dale McMaster, Chief Investment Officer, and Darren Backus, Chief Client Relations and Legal Officer. I'm happy to remind you that tonight's meeting is being broadcast live on Shaw TV and streamed on the Legislative Assembly website at www.assembly.ab.ca. I'd like to encourage everyone to join the conversation and contribute to our discussion during the live broadcast. You can submit your questions through Twitter or by email. The information can be seen on the bottom of your screen. Simply submit your questions and we will endeavor to respond to as many as time will allow during question and answer segment of the meeting, which will be immediately following our panel presentations. We promise to keep our points and answers brief to allow us to address as many of your questions and comments as possible. Your input is important to us, and I encourage you to participate. Please note that this meeting is being recorded by Alberta Hansard, and transcripts from this meeting will be available online on the Assembly website. By the end of the meeting, we'll have walked you through the history, mission, long-term performance, and future of the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund. With that, let's take a look at the following video on the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund, followed by our presentations.
The Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund. Your fund, your future. When you picture the Alberta of tomorrow, what do you see? Is it stronger and more prosperous than today? Do you imagine a vibrant province for your children and grandchildren to inherit? Fundamentally, we all want to leave a legacy. We all want to leave the world a little better than we found it. The Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund is a large part of tomorrow's vibrant Alberta. This tradition of providing security for future Albertans began with the generations before us. Alberta in the 1970s was in the midst of an oil and gas boom. A time of prosperity, often referred to as a modern-day gold rush, provincial coffers overflowed and the population swelled. All too familiar with the boom and bust reality of the oil and gas industry, Albertans recognized that resources are finite, and this time could be short-lived. In 1976, Premier Peter Lougheed asked Albertans to prepare for the day when revenue from the sale of non-renewable resources would form a smaller percentage of provincial government revenues. He posed this fundamental question:
have we got the courage? Have we got the stamina? And have we got the determination to put aside and save and invest what's never before been done in democratic terms? A Heritage Savings Trust Fund for the future.
The answer to Premier Lougheed's question was yes. Yes, planning for the continued prosperity of future Albertans is a priority. Yes, supporting economic diversification will make our province stronger. And so the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund was born. May 19, 1976. Royal assent was given to the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund Act, which outlined 3 objectives for the Heritage Fund: to save for the future, to strengthen or diversify the economy, and to improve the quality of life in Alberta. In the 1990s, the Act was amended to stipulate that the mission of the fund was to provide prudent stewardship of the savings from Alberta's non-renewable resources by providing the greatest financial returns on those savings for current and future generations of Albertans. In support of the new mission, changes were made to the governance of the fund, which is now essentially managed on the same basis as an institutional endowment fund. Today, the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund remains an important factor in Alberta's economic equation. The investment of the fund focuses on 2 important concepts: diversification to manage risk and long-term planning to maximize returns. The Heritage Fund's portfolio consists of investments in public and private companies, bonds, real estate, and infrastructure. The President of Treasury Board and Minister of Finance is ultimately responsible for the fund and its investments. The department looks after setting the long-term strategy, developing investment policy, and monitoring investment performance. The purchasing of stocks, bonds, and other investments for the portfolio is managed by Alberta Investment Management Corporation, or AIMCO. A Crown corporation since 2008, AIMCO's sole shareholder is the province of Alberta. The Standing Committee on the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund is an all-party committee consisting of 9 members of the Legislative Assembly. Each year it reviews and approves the fund's performance and annual report, as well as reports on the fund's operations. The committee also holds public meetings with Albertans to report on investment activities and results, as well as reporting back to the Legislative Assembly on whether the mission of the fund is being fulfilled. Ultimately, the value of the Heritage Fund depends on the amounts deposited into the fund, the amounts taken out of the fund, and the investment earnings of the fund each year. It's important to note that while the capital of the fund has always been earmarked for future generations, over the years, income from the fund has been used to support healthcare, education, social programs, infrastructure, and capital expenditures. Important endowments such as the Medical Research Fund and the Scholarship Fund were funded from the Heritage Fund. In the past year, $200 million was transferred to the Alberta Heritage Scholarship Fund to provide assistance to those studying in the trades. The funding is enabling more people to pursue fulfilling careers in the trades, while at the same time helping to address Alberta's skilled labor shortages. The Government of Alberta and the Standing Committee on the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund continue to check in with Albertans to ensure support for the fund, and Albertans have made it clear that saving for the future remains a priority. In order to leave the world a little better than we found it, we are committed to planning for tomorrow, today. The Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund is a large part of Alberta's tomorrow. the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund. Your fund, your future.
With the Alberta Treasury Board and Finance to walk us through a financial update on the Heritage Fund. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Epp.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and members of the committee. Minister Ceci and Deputy Minister Gilmore are unable to make it tonight and would like to send their regrets. I'm certainly pleased to be here to represent the department and have the opportunity to discuss with you Alberta's Heritage Fund and its recent performance. To start, we want to talk about the investment philosophy of the fund and its basic objectives. As was mentioned in the video, the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund was established in 1976, and it gets its mandate today from the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund Act. This legislation sets out the investment objective for the fund, which, as the video stated, is to maximize long-term financial returns for the fund, subject to an acceptable level of risk. Based on this objective, the fund is invested with a long-term focus, using strategies that can be expected to generate investment returns on a consistent basis. As such, the fund is invested in a well-diversified and global portfolio. This approach allows the fund to reduce risk while at the same time earning higher returns than it otherwise would. The Heritage Fund is invested in an efficient manner as well. Its investments are pooled with those of other AIMCO clients to provide cost efficiency. AIMCO has over $90 billion under management, which allows it to minimize investment cost. This size also allows AIMCO's clients opportunities to participate in investment transactions that are simply not available to smaller funds. The President of Treasury Board and Minister of Finance is responsible under the legislation for investing the Heritage Fund. This responsibility includes establishing investment policies for the fund. These policies guide how the fund is invested, its tolerance for risk, and the benchmark for evaluating investment performance. This policy, by the way, called the Statement of Investment Policies and Goals, can be found on the Heritage Fund's website at www.albertaheritagefund.com. Among other things, the investment policy establishes a target asset allocation for the fund. At the broadest level, the fund has a target allocation of 50% to equities, 30% to inflation-sensitive and alternative investments, and 20% to fixed income. This policy portfolio can be seen as an expression or one expression of the fund's risk tolerance. Equities, of course, include shares of companies, and we invest in shares of companies from across the world. We invest, or AIMCO on the fund's behalf, invests on public stock markets, as well as investments in private companies. Equities are chosen and form the largest part of the portfolio because they can be expected over the long run to have the highest returns. They also have higher risks, and at times will cause the investment fund or the investment returns for the funds to be less than what other investments may drive. But as we will see later, investments in equities have benefited the fund this year as they have in many other years. Inflation-sensitive and alternative investments are intended to provide a combination of investment returns and protection against inflation. Examples of these and the most prominent investments in this class are real estate and infrastructure investments, whose revenues can be expected to rise with inflation and give some protection. Fixed income investments include the bonds and debts of governments and companies within the economy. The fund is invested in both publicly traded bonds and private market loans. This segment of the portfolio provides stability and has the lowest risk within the portfolio. So the target asset allocation is 50% to equities, 30% to inflation sensitive, and 20% to fixed income. The current asset allocation as of March 31st, 2015 was 51% to equities, 30% to inflation sensitive and alternative investments, and 17% to fixed income. There's also a 2% allocation to strategic opportunities. This asset class, which is a special class, allows AIMCO to find opportunities that don't typically or wouldn't easily fit into one of the three other buckets, but are opportunities to earn high returns at low levels of risk. During the year, the Heritage Fund earned gross income of just over $1.8 billion and had a net return of 12.5%. After the $1.8 billion in gross income, and after investment expenses of $147 million, net income for the fund was $1.68 billion for this year. The strongest contributor to income was the equity segment of the fund, which generated $1.4 billion in gross income, as you can see on the chart. Global equities were the primary source, as the returns on these investments benefited from the fall of the Canadian dollar. It is important to note that the Heritage Fund holds a significant portion of its investments in foreign currencies. 42% of the equities held by the Heritage Fund are held in foreign markets. This was a change that was initiated in 2011 after studying the currency exposures of the province as a whole. And we determined that, as we've seen recently, the Canadian dollar tends to fall when oil prices fall. And so, not strictly as a perfect hedge or anything, but to provide some protection against times when the price of crude oil falls, we deliberately shifted some of the investments of the Heritage Fund into foreign markets. Therefore, when the province's economy is hurt by lower oil prices, the Heritage Fund's investments are structured to provide a small offset by earning higher return when the Canadian dollar falls. It is estimated that this shift, which was implemented in 2011, has added approximately $540 million to the Heritage Fund's earnings in the last 4 years. Finally, by legislation, a portion of the fund's earnings are retained in the fund to protect against inflation. This year, $210 million of the fund's earnings were retained in the fund to protect against inflation. The remaining approximately $1.5 billion was transferred to the government's general revenue fund to fund government programs and services. Since its creation in 1976, the Heritage Fund has contributed over $38 billion in investment earnings to help government budgets and capital projects. In addition to these $38 billion in investment earnings, two important endowment funds, the Medical Research Fund and the Scholarship Fund, were funded from the Heritage Fund. This has been an important part of the government's budget for a number of years and has allowed Albertans to benefit from things like better programming or, depending on how you look at it, lower taxes. The historical performance of the fund is shown on the chart on the screen. Over the past 5 years, the Heritage Fund has been very successful and has produced an average annual return of 11.7%. Inflation over the last 5 years has averaged 1.6%, so we have earned a return of 10.1% over inflation. Now, why is that important? The Heritage Fund's long-term investment goal is to earn a return of 4.5% plus inflation over a 5-year period. That has been stated in our ministry's business plans for years. We also have a goal that AIMCO should add another 1% or 100 basis points of return using their expertise and the flexibility that we provide to them in the investment policy to earn additional returns. So, with inflation being 1.6%, we expect to earn 5.5%, 4.5% plus 1% for active management. So that makes it 7.1% was our target return over the last 5 years. A return of 11.7% is 4.6% higher than our target return. Over the past 10 years, a period which includes the financial crisis of 2008-2009, the fund has earned an average annual return of 8%. Over this period, inflation averaged 1.7%, making the target return equal to 5.5 plus 1.7% or 7.2%. So over 10 years, we have earned an excess return of 0.8% for the fund. In terms of performance over the last year, as I mentioned earlier, the fund earned a return of 12.5% this last year. One of the things we do is measure year-by-year performance using a passive benchmark. How would the fund would have done if it had been invested without the active management of AIMCO? This past year, the passive benchmark earned a return of 14.7%, which means that active management had a negative performance of 2.2%. One thing about active management is that some years it's going to be good and some years it's going to be not as good. So this is not something that I want to concern the committee about by any means. It's just a fact. The chart shows the performance and benchmark returns for the various segments within the fund. As you can see, there were strong positive returns from all primary segments within the portfolio. It was a very good year for investment returns. The strongest performance came from global equities with a return of 18% on the year, and private equities, which returned 15.2% on the year. Both of these segments benefited from the falling Canadian dollar, which I discussed previously. The best active management returns came from real estate, where the actual return was 4.1% higher than the benchmark. On the other hand, private equities saw the weakest active management returns, with the actual return being 5.8% lower than the benchmark. Finally, looking forward for the fund, one of the significant developments this year was that in budget 2015, the government announced that it would be changing the asset allocation of the Heritage Fund by allocating 3% of the portfolio to growth opportunities in Alberta. That's approximately $540 million because the fund's market value is around $18 billion. This allocation is intended to encourage economic growth and diversification in Alberta. However, it is important to note that these investments in Alberta growth opportunities will be subject to the same legislative objective of maximizing the fund's long-term investment earnings at an acceptable level of risk. These investments, in other words, will be sourced in Alberta for the benefit of Albertans, but will be judged first and foremost by AIMCO on their investment merits. Going forward, the department and AIMCO will be looking at a number of aspects of the fund and working on a number of projects together to ensure that the fund continues to be invested optimally for the province. These projects include evaluating the fund's risk tolerances and how those risk tolerances are measured to ensure that the fund will continue to maximize investment returns at a prudent level of risk, developing strategies for minimizing downside risk, and analyzing the fund's asset allocation based on current and expected future market developments and trends. That concludes my remarks, and I would pass it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Epp. I will now call upon Dale McMaster, Chief Investment Officer of AIMCO, to provide a market update.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and the committee. I think I'll commence and then Dale will comment on some more broader economic points. Good evening to our guests. Over the next 10 minutes, Dale and I are going to speak with you about three things. First of all, a general overview of AIMCO. Second of all, some commentary on the Heritage Fund from the perspective of AIMCO, the investment manager. And then, Madam Chair, as I mentioned, Dale will provide the committee and our guests and Albertans with some general views on the economic conditions globally. As a starting point, AIMCO is a provincial corporation that is headquartered right here in Edmonton, just down the street at 109 in Jasper. Since inception in 2008, we've attracted investment talent from all across the world, while at the same time sourcing local investment talent and bringing it to what we view to be a crown jewel of Alberta. On a day-to-day basis, we have the privilege of investing funds for the benefit of 375,000 beneficiaries of public sector pensions, as well as all Albertans for endowments such as the Heritage Fund. This is a brief overview of our clients. You'll notice that in excess of 50% of the assets that we have the privilege of managing are represented by the public sector pension funds. The Heritage Fund, which we're discussing this evening, falls into the category of endowment funds. Madam Chair, as you touched upon, as the asset manager for these clients, we provide them with a broad range of investment opportunities. These range from public debt and equities, which are listed on the open markets, through to the illiquid assets, such as real estate, infrastructure, and mortgages. It's important to note that everyone at AIMCO remains constantly mindful of our responsibility to the clients and also to the ultimate beneficiaries. And we ensure that our day-to-day activities are always consistent with our mandate, which you'll see here is to maximize the risk-adjusted net investment returns in a manner that is responsive to our clients' needs and their expectations. And finally, regardless of where the members of the AIMCO family have come from, we focus upon being contributing members of where our homes are today. And as part of that, we're very proud to support a number of local organizations that provide grassroots support to the community and to the economy. Now I'll turn it over to Dale, our Chief Investment Officer.
Thank you, Darren. I'd like to take a few minutes, if I could, to talk about returns, markets, and what we expect in the near term. At AIMCO, we're long-term global investors, so it's useful to look at where we've come from to help frame the conversation. So what I'm showing here at the top part of this chart is the long-term historic returns for stocks and bonds. And if you look at the top section of the chart, you can see that over the very long run, stocks have returned 10%, and the lower part of the chart shows that bond returns have been 5% over very long periods of time. And I'd like to draw your attention as well to the 80s and 90s, which represent the greatest period of returns for both stocks and bonds that we've seen in the last 100 years. And if you look at the bond returns over the last 35 years, in fact, every decade the returns have been greater than the long run average. So we've really come through a period with extraordinary returns. Other than the 2000s in equities, where we had two significant market corrections of 50%, it's been a pretty good investing environment. In fact, equities, of course, once again, this decade are again above the long-term average. So I think to a certain extent, investors have been spoiled by the environment of the last 40 years, and there's reason to believe that the returns going forward are going to be much less. So we have to temper our expectations. First of all, why were returns so great in the last 35 years? And this next chart shows you interest rates, 10-year interest rates going back to the 50s. And what you can see is from 1980 to the current day, interest rates have fallen. and we've had 35 years of declining rates. And the value of any asset is simply the cash flows, dividends, earnings that it returns, discounted at a discount rate to the present value. And if you lower the discount rate, the value goes up. So this has driven asset prices up, not only for equities, but real estate as well, and bonds. But as you can see from the chart, we're pretty close to zero. So this environment is over now. And we're likely to see interest rates rise in the coming years. So this is why we believe that we need to temper our expectations. These terrific returns we've seen in the Heritage Fund have been great. We've enjoyed them, but it's going to be a more challenging environment. And that's the first message I'd like to give you. Fast forward to today, and recent current events have been driving the market. There's really been four things that have driven asset prices this year. Number one, oil, which is near and dear to our hearts, has had a difficult time. Oil prices fell from $110 to $40 in the last 12 months. Obviously, that's had a huge impact on Canada and investing in Alberta. We also had issues in Greece, with Greece once again teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. That drove stock prices down in the spring. No sooner had we moved through that trial when we found out that China was slowing. So we're already in the midst of a slow growth global environment, and then one last engine of growth was showing signs of slowing down. And that set off a market correction. And lastly, the focus on U.S. interest rates. When are they going up? How much are they going up? Has been driving investor behavior. In all likelihood, we'll see an increase in the U.S. rates in December. So what has this meant for the markets? Well, we had a stock market correction this year, first time in about 4 years. We were long overdue. Normally we get a correction of 5 to 10% every 18 months or so. So it shouldn't come as a surprise. So volatility's picked up. As you can see from the top chart, stock market selection, sector selection is very important. The S&P is up about 2%, whereas the Toronto Stock Exchange is down close to 8% on the year. So where you invest matters in today's environment. Although we expect interest rates in the U.S. to go up later this year, towards the end of this year and into next year, we expect Canada to lag. And even in the U.S., the path of interest rates will be slow and gradual. So what does that mean for the markets? Well, we expect the public markets to become more volatile and less liquid. And while that volatility from stock market corrections, when they come, is uncomfortable, but it presents AIMCO the opportunity to put money to work at attractive prices. We're long-term investors, and our most important assets are size, cash, patience, and scale. So we don't suffer from short-termism. So if we do get a correction of 5 to 10%, it allows us the opportunity to put money to work from the Heritage Fund in very attractive assets that'll grow and earn returns over the very long run. That concludes my comments.
Thank you, Mr. McMaster and Mr. Anthrakis. That concludes the formal presentations. Before I open the floor to your questions, I would like to remind everyone that you're welcome to join the conversation and submit your questions to the committee or our panel of experts. You can submit your questions to the Twitter handle @LegAssemblyOfAB using hashtag ABHeritageFund or by email to committees@assembly.ab.ca. Again, your comments are important to us, and we will attempt to answer as many questions as possible during the meeting. I'll now open the floor for questions from our in-house audience. Please be sure to state your name for the record before you begin speaking. If you want to go to the microphone to the right of me.
I notice, and it always puzzles me, that because the interest...
Could I get you to state your name first, please?
Hager, live in Edmonton. I know that a market in China has dropped, but still their growth rate is something like 6 or 7%, isn't it? Well, wouldn't we love to have a growth rate of 6 or 7%? And why is it such a tragedy? I don't understand that.
Thanks for the question. And I would tend to agree with you. You know, China has downgraded from 7% to 6, 5. I mean, it's hard to say exactly what the growth rate is in China. Some of the data coming from there isn't reliable. But I would agree with you. As that economy grows, mathematically, it becomes very difficult to continue to grow at these high rates. We're not too fussed about what's happening in China. In fact, it's somewhat of a two-tiered economy with the old state-owned enterprises and traditional industries like steel and manufacturing, and the new consumer-related industries, which are growing very well. So the contacts we have in China tell us that you know, it's a fairly robust economy. So we as investors are with you. We don't share the anxiety that you see exercised in the market when these growth numbers hit and stock markets correct. So we would agree with you.
Thank you. Mr. Nielsen, do you have any questions from the
I
other
do, Madam
audience?
Chair. An email question from AM in Edmonton. How do you decide how the heritage funds are used or distributed?
Mr. Rapp?
The earnings of the Heritage Fund by legislation, there's an amount retained in the fund for inflation. The remainder of the fund goes into the fund's earnings go into the Heritage Funds, or transferred from the Heritage Fund into the General Revenue Fund. And how they are spent is determined by the government's budget and all the bills needed to pass those budgets.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions, Mr. Nielsen?
Yes, Madam Chair. I have a question from Twitter user Munzader. Why can't Norway Fund be compared to Heritage Fund?
There are a number of differences between Norway's fund and Alberta's fund, and certainly a number of differences between Norway and Alberta. Norwegians made different choices, first and foremost, than Albertans did. It should be noted that Norway has higher income taxes than Alberta, has a 23% sales tax, and its neighbors, Sweden and other Nordic countries, also have similar high tax structures. So when they compete for jobs and businesses and investment dollars, their investment is much different. Alberta in the 70s and 80s and 90s and even now competes with its neighbors. And while we have lower taxes than many, we don't have lower taxes than all. And there are a number of U.S. states, especially in the 80s and 90s, that had lower tax regimes. So that's one context. Norway's oil is primarily offshore oil, so it's already on tidewater. Alberta's oil, as we all know, is not on tidewater and does not have access to tidewater. Norway's oil is light sweet crude. In Alberta, we've had, in the early 70s, a light sweet crude oil boom, but it was nowhere near the size of Norway's in terms of volumes. We had a natural gas boom up until about 2009 in the 2000s. But again, we could only sell our natural gas in North America. And fracking and other technologies have reduced the value of gas since about the beginning of 2009. Fortunately, we had a third opportunity to benefit from energy, which we'll continue to benefit from, and that is the oil sands, which really took off around that same time, 2008, 7, 9, I don't know. But bitumen does not provide the same returns as light sweet crude. That is not the same quality of oil. So there are taxation differences. There are quality of oil differences, access to tidewater. There is a number of differences. Norway's a country. Alberta's a sub-sovereign. It's a province. We don't control all the fiscal decisions. We don't control tax decisions made in Ottawa. This is not to say whether Alberta's choices were right or wrong, but we made different choices than Norway. And we have benefited from those, but choices have to be made. None are perfect.
Thank you, Mr. App. Is there anyone else who has any questions? Okay, if you'd like to take the microphone to the right, please. And state your name.
My name is Doug Pruden, and I'm a citizen of Edmonton.
Thank you.
Some people may have heard
Welcome.
me before. I'm just wondering if anybody in the committee can please explain the scholarship program that is given to students. And after that, I would like to suggest a potential program to help Alberta learners, adult Alberta learners such as myself, to re-enter, for potential re-entry into careers that they used to be in, but could not do it because of the potential high education debt levels. But I'll get into it after the first question is answered regarding what they do for scholarships for students.
Okay. Mr. App, do you know?
I think he asked the committee members, but I'm happy to say, strictly speaking, that's outside the mandate of this committee and outside the mandate of this fund. But I don't want to shut you down by any means. The scholarship fund, the two primary scholarships are scholarships to high school graduates that attain high marks is the most prominent one. So if you attain, I believe, an 80 average in grades 10, 11, and 12, you get a scholarship, I believe, of $2,500. And if you only hit it in certain grades, you get a lesser amount. About a year ago, the government of the day added $200 million from the Heritage Fund, transferred it to the Scholarship Fund, and those funds, or that endowment, provides funds for training in the trade sector. So that's the mandate of the Scholarship Fund as it is now.
The trades sector, apparently, because I read some newspapers and talk to educators out there, Nate, U of A, etc., is short of skilled labor, skilled people to enter the trades, and some of that perhaps is because of the fear of the high debt of education. That's one of my fears. Now, I am standing here with a lot of potential skills. Some skills I do already, which are athletic related, but other skills that I've trained in are not being used. And I do get asked that question a few times, and I thought of this Heritage Trust Fund thing. Perhaps they could invest in the education system so people like me can get a grant similar to what high school students get, and just pay for the whole thing until I am acceptable to industry to re-enter these fields. Now, I might represent hundreds or even thousands of middle-aged learners that just cannot access education because of the debt, and a lot of us have different ever-increasing costs of living or anything like that. So there are challenges, and a grant system would assist in that. Now, I know this committee may not be able to take a suggestion like that, but perhaps it could be passed along as an investment in the future of actual Albertans, whether it's in the schooling, the scholarshiping for adult learners, or otherwise free tuition or whatever it may be. And there are examples in different countries of the world where they do this. I won't list all these countries, but they're out there where they even have free education or free college education. And some of them are oil producing nations.
Well, I will take the transcript from your question and make sure that the Minister of Job Skills and Training sees it, and because her department would be the department that would handle something like that. So I'll refer it to Minister Sigurdsson, and we'll see what comes of it.
Thank you so much for your time and the committee's time for listening. And
No problem.
I know in my life it has been a barrier to perhaps engage in further adult learning, and maybe other people's lives too. But thank goodness people like myself have alternative cushions or ways to keep things happening in our lives.
Thank you for your question. Mr. Nielsen, any more questions?
Yes, Madam Chair. I have an email question from JS. What was the initial investment in the Heritage Fund when it was created in 1976?
One second. We just have to look up the numbers. So in 1976-77, a total of $2.1 billion in resource revenues, non-renewable resource revenues, was transferred to the fund, and there were expenditures of $36 billion in capital projects that year, and a net income from the fund of $88 million. So at the end of the first year, it had a value of almost $2.2 billion. In following years, from say 77, 78 to about 82, 83, approximately $1 to $1.5 billion was transferred each year. And then in 83, 84 to 86, 87, non-renewable resource revenues of approximately $700 million were transferred into the fund. And in 1987, the government of the day stopped transfers of non-renewable resources or resource revenues into the fund and simply retained them in the general revenue fund.
Thank you, Mr. App. Any more questions from the audience?
Thank you. My name is Dan Beren, and I'm involved in my local council in Thornhill County. I also receive a position of Reeve. And what I've been hearing from the public is the issues of funding. And today, with information that's so readily available, historically, the Bank of Canada used to provide public funding. It was created in the 30s basically as a public bank. And by 1975, it's not fulfilling its statutory requirements. So for example, what it would do is provide funding, a credit, to all levels of government, so federal, provincial, and municipal. So I was wondering if the committee was considering, or has ever considered, providing public funding for these levels of government. So for example, it's simple interest, or an administration fee that is, for example, less than 1% simple interest along those parameters, enough to cover the administration of these loans, rather than borrowing from the private sector, which, when you look at debt federally, provincially, borrowing from the private sector creates huge burdens on the taxpayer. So has there been any consideration for moving into this public banking area?
Mr. Rapp?
I can only comment on the legislation that the House has passed, and the legislation that guides the fund is one to maximize long-term investment returns.
And Mr. McMaster, is there anything you can add to that?
I think so.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Nielsen, any more questions?
Yes, I have a question from Twitter user Jim V in Calgary. Does AIMCO invest in marijuana companies?
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience?
My name is Chips Reed, live in Edmonton, retired. It came up tonight that our government, the Alberta government, stopped transferring non-renewable resource income into the Heritage Savings Trust Fund. Why did they do that?
I wasn't a member of the legislature, and that was an act passed by the legislature. I assume that the legislature and the government of the day decided that it could not afford to run the large deficits it was running and continue to increase those deficits while they had a revenue source available to them. Clearly, you don't agree with that decision, but that was the decision that the legislature in 1987 made.
Why can't they reverse that decision based on the income they're receiving now? I mean, it doesn't seem fair to me that to the citizens of Alberta that we no longer put any money away from what Premier Lougheed started when he was taking 30% of the cash cow that we're sitting on, which is under the ground here, which belongs to Albertans and Canadians. So I think that's a shame.
Do you have any other questions? Okay, Mr. Nielsen, do you have any other questions?
Yes, I have one from someone off of Twitter, username Heidick from Calgary. Can the funds be used to subsidize industry since we are experiencing a downturn in the economy, and if not, why not?
The funds legislation is clear that the funds must be invested in a commercial manner, if you will, to maximize long-term earnings at an acceptable rate of risk. Economic development investments don't fit under that mandate since they don't maximize returns. The legislature could choose, and is certainly able to choose, to change that law and make those funds available if it chose. That's entirely the purview of the Legislative Assembly.
Thank you, Mr. App. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Do you have any more, Mr. Nielsen?
Yes, Madam Chair. Email comment from Rick Dolphin in Edmonton. With the investment return worse under management than the passive fund, and with quarter one returns down to a miserable 1% or 0.1%, is it time to start questioning why we are paying for a $3 million AIMCO CEO and a bunch of high-salaried investment brokers and not simply move the government's investment management back in the house or simply turn it over to a computer?
Okay. Mr. McMaster?
Well, first of all, AIMCO and its managers can't control the absolute return on the funds. So most of the return is going to come from the asset mix that is set for the Heritage Fund. Our job is to try and add value over, the benchmarks. And while this past year our value add fell short, over longer periods we have shown that we can add value. And that's really what it's about. We are long-term investors, and we do not focus on the quarter, the year. We're looking at 5 years and 10-year, returns. And I think the strategies we have in place have shown that we can add value over the passive benchmark for the benefit of all Albertans.
I would add to that, and this is partially my fault, and I apologize. Over the last 5 years, and you can find these numbers in the annual report, the active management, while it was, as Dale said, negative this last year, has added an average 1.2% per year. So we are achieving that and exceeding that target of 100 basis points, or 1% annually. So it is dangerous, as Dale said, to look at 1 year returns and 1 year active management returns. AIMCO has exceeded its targets over the last 5 years, and we expect them to continue to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Epp and Mr. McMaster. Another one from online.
Yes, from Twitter, from Tachyon. If the fund is a rainy day fund, isn't now a rainy day?
Nowhere in the legislation is the fund described as a rainy day fund. The mandate of the fund is to save for the future, not to save for a rainy day. So I know a lot of people think that it is a rainy day, but the legislation is quite clear on its mandate, and that mandate does not include rainy day or any similar concept.
Thank you, Mr. Epp.
Anybody in the audience?
Anyone else in the audience with questions?
Hi, Rory Coopmans, live in the West End of Edmonton. Just curious, couldn't they have some sort of advisory council that, say, paid a nominal fee of $1 a piece a year for all the living former provincial treasurers and or finance ministers to help advise where the Heritage Fund should go, say with Minister Dinning and all these Minister Day, all these different people that are out of office now? I couldn't think of anybody better to have some ministers and, say, deputy ministers who used to be in charge of the fund at its inception that are all living and still have good ideas to contribute and explore, make our past, make the fund stronger for the future by bringing old ideas together with new ideas and old administrations together with new. Thank you.
Does anyone want to tackle that one?
I believe that's a political question.
AIMCO, I believe, was created to be an arm's length investment company. So it would be just like you hiring an investment company. We're doing the same. It's better than having government doing the investing. Wouldn't you say, Mr. Backus?
Madam Chair, I think you've absolutely summarized that appropriately. AIMCO was created to operate at arm's length and independent from the government, and in particular, two key tenets of governance to protect the ultimate beneficiaries. One of which is the professional board that AIMCO enjoys, that is oversight of the organization, and the second is that the investment decisions are not subject to political interference. So I think you summarized that well.
Thank you. Any more online questions, Mr. Nielsen?
Yes, Madam Chair, from a Twitter user, Alberta Activist. Is capitalism's drive to profit maximization going to cause it to implode should AIMCO invest in social ventures?
AIMCO's mandate from the Heritage Fund is consistent with the Act, which is to maximize the investment return. If I can just touch on the social venture piece of that question and expand it a bit. Although AIMCO's mandate is to maximize the net risk-adjusted returns, we of course are mindful of environmental, social, and governance factors as well. And the reason being is that it's clear that investment opportunities, companies that are aware of, sensitive to, and have plans for environmental factors, social factors, and practice good governance are better performing investments.
Thank you. Mr. Nielsen.
Yes, Madam Chair, from email. AIMCO is a signatory to the Carbon Disclosure Project and CDP Water. What activities are these projects involved in, and how might this contribute to Alberta's climate change plan?
So that's correct. AIMCO is signatory to CDP, Carbon and Water. Being a signatory involves a commitment to have our investments report on carbon emissions and then also waters. So that reporting is amalgamated by the organizations that the question references and then is made public. Now to the second part of the question as to how it could be used, I don't know the answer. The purpose, I can say that the purpose of AIMCO's signing to those organizations, and in addition to AIMCO signing on to the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investing, is one of transparency. We believe as stewards and having the privilege of investing funds on behalf of the pensioners and Albertans that transparency is key. And as I mentioned, that environmental, social, governance issues do impact the returns. And so signing to these type of obligations are to ensure that our ultimate beneficiaries and clients are aware of how these factors are taken into account.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions from our live audience? Go ahead.
So my name is Dan Beren. A moment ago...
A wee bit, please.
Oh, pardon me. Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
So a moment ago, one of the fellows from AIMCO mentioned that in relation to investment decisions, was it referred to as no political involvement? Is that what you were saying?
That's correct.
Okay. So in that case, what checks and balances are there? So for example, AIMCO has the ability to manage these investments. So what if there are some bad investments made? Are there any checks and balances to ensure that AIMCO is properly investing where there would be no problems in the future? Or for lack of a better term, is it a free-for-all for AIMCO?
It is certainly not a free-for-all, but the question as far as checks and balances comes down to one of governance. And when AIMCO was created, as Madam Chair commented previously, as the province's investment manager at an arm's length basis, a number of governance checks were put in place, and allow me to run through a few. First of all, as the shareholder, AIMCO is accountable and reports to the government of Alberta through Treasury Board and Finance. And as shareholder, there is regular reporting and oversight. Second of all, as I noted as a governance item, which is the professional board. AIMCO has a professional board that is populated on a skills-based process. And these individuals, keeping an eye on the mandates provided by the clients, have oversight of the investment processes of AIMCO. And then once we get to the management of AIMCO, we are very much like a private sector investment manager organization with strong compliance, strong oversight, both pre-trade and post-trade, and ongoing monitoring of our investments as they relate to the mandates provided to us by our clients.
If I could just add to that, in addition to forums like this, for our other clients, pension clients, they have boards which also provide oversight of AIMCO's investment activities, as well as their own consultants that review our performance, our practices around risk management, our costs, every aspect of our organization. So as an investment firm, it has a tremendous amount of oversight.
And then finally, I go back to a comment I'd made earlier, which is one of transparency. As it relates to the Heritage Fund, through this committee, the public is provided with transparency on the actions taken by AIMCO. And as Dale mentioned, with respect to our public sector pension plan clients, they're provided with an exceptional degree of transparency as well, as far as how we are exercising their instructions from an investment perspective.
So these processes that you say are in place for accountability, is that all accessible on the website or for the public to view, or is that somewhere else?
Certainly a number of them are on the AIMCO, Alberta Investment Management Company website, and as well as a provincial corporation, we are audited by the Auditor General, who of course makes their report public on an annual basis.
So all of them, like for example, I'm learning in this process, and also other people in the public as well. So is there anywhere specifically we can be directed to take a look at that information?
One place you may want to look is our website, as well as our annual report. I think there's a tremendous amount of disclosure in our annual report around every aspect of our organization: the investment, performance, risk management, compensation, oversight, board. It's quite thorough. So I would say that's a good place to start.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Nielsen, any more questions?
Yes, Madam Chair. From Twitter, Adam Gallen. If ATB Financial was a publicly traded bank, would AIMCO find it a good investment?
It might. I haven't looked at it, so I can't say. But I would just reiterate that in all these things, when it comes to investing, we're investing on economic return, and we are global. And so the screen starts with the global universe. And even with that, we have quite a lot of investments in Alberta, roughly 8 billion out of the 85 or so billion in the fund, and the Heritage Fund, I think, has about 1.7 billion invested in Alberta. So even with that standard, Alberta's been a very good place to invest.
Thank you. Any more questions from the audience?
Madam Chair, if I can note as well too, ATB does post a financial report every year. So if the person who was asking the question is curious about how they are doing overall, they can go online and visit that annual report as well.
Thank you, Mr. Sucha. Go ahead, sir.
I am back. My name is Doug Pruden. I'll just give you very brief information about myself. I'm a multi-world record holder, athlete in fitness. And I think the Alberta Heritage Trust Fund should invest in what I would call a Alberta Excellence Fund or a Spirit of Alberta Fund. Spirit of Alberta Excellence Fund, where they would take people like me and maybe 20 others who are known perhaps or who are champions at what they do in education, business, or athlete. And we're not talking just Olympic gold medalists or chairman of the board of this or the president of that school, but really neat people. And you take us all over the world and promote this beautiful province. I've been around Europe and USA, and I showed the mountains, and they cry when I'm in the hotel. They go, "My, is your province ever beautiful?" And they say, "We don't have mountains like that. We don't have freedom like that. We don't have the beautiful education system that you guys have. We admire you. Is it really that good?" So I'm already promoting Alberta because I do love this province and the amazing community that has built the champion from what I am, because to be a world record holder takes community. It's mandatory with Guinness. And without community, it could never have happened. But I don't want to just boast about myself. I want to boast about what Albertans are building even today in each individual life of Alberta, how this province is steadfast in their helping of other people and promoting its values and its education and its beauty, because Alberta is an ever-changing, growing, and beautiful multicultural organization and a totally beautiful organism that needs to be shared amongst people all over the world. So if any opportunity comes out there, I will answer my phone, and if to promote this province more and more and more, not only in Canada, but all over the world, because we have something to tell. We have a great story that is still being written. I know not only in my life, it's always ongoing, but in the many lives of people around me and in every Albertan. Thank you.
What I'm going to suggest is the Minister of Culture would be the person you would talk to. So if you do up a proposal and send it into his office, that's who would be the one who would look after something like that.
Thank you.
Dr. Turner.
And the minister is, the Minister for Tourism and for Culture is Minister David Egan.
Another question, Mr. Nielsen?
Yes, Madam Chair. Through email from DO in Calgary, what is the percentage of the fund that is invested in infrastructure, and what is the infrastructure that that fund owns?
Go ahead.
In terms of the investments that we have in infrastructure, we have a diversified mix of assets, including Chilean toll road, transmission in Chile as well. We have Porterbrook, which is rail cars in the UK. It's quite a diversified mix of assets.
So at March 31st, 2015, the fund's infrastructure investments total $1.3 billion. And as Dell mentioned, that included a combination of toll roads, airports, ports, power and energy, water utilities, all kinds of things. It's well diversified.
Don't forget shopping centers.
Oh, that would be in real estate, Madam Chair.
It's infrastructure too, though, because they're under construction, one of them.
All right.
Okay, any more questions? Go ahead.
Hi there, my name is Nate Glubish. I'm from Sherwood Park. My question relates to, I think we talked earlier about how a portion of the fund revenue or earnings is retained for inflation proofing, and the balance is currently transferred into the general revenue fund of the province. So a couple of questions. One is, can the government change that legislation? And number two, if so, does the current government have plans to change that to allow for it to withdraw funds from the fund to deal with the current deficit challenges that we're facing over the next few years?
Certainly the legislature, since it created the act, can change the act and decide to do whatever it wants with the Heritage Fund. It could decide to use the fund to fund infrastructure investments or fund social programs, whatever. Certainly the legislature has that within its power. There's nothing limiting that power. Whether or not they would do so is another question. As far as your second question, which, if I recall, was has the government considered that? While I'm certainly haven't been a party to any of those discussions, one way or the other, that is not my role. Budget 2015 clearly indicated that the government is not going to be touching the Heritage Fund to provide or to be used as a funding source in providing for either general revenues or for to fund or finance capital investments.
Thank you.
Mr. Nielsen.
Yes, Madam Chair. I have a question from a Twitter user, Adam Gallant. Would any Alberta government consider using the Heritage Fund for economic stimulus?
I think other than the program we've brought out in this budget to bring investment to Albertans, to bring jobs to Albertans, I think that's the best way to use part of the fund for economic stimulus based on the guidelines of the fund that AIMCO has got set up for investment purposes. Ms. Renaud?
I think it's important to remember that these decisions are made in the legislature, and there is a democratic process involved. And so, you know, that's not something that we could arbitrarily decide and implement. But I think going back to AIMCO's purpose and vision, they are long-term investors, and it is long-term investment. And I think that's why they are so strong and that they've done so well. So I think it's important to remember that. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else in the audience that would like to ask a question? Come to the microphone, please.
My name is Nicholas Zuba. My question is, does Heritage Trust Fund invest any funds in affordable housing? I think that would be under real estate investment. Of course, I think that there would be no financial return on such investment. So is there investment in kind of social housing or affordable housing, or would you consider making that kind of investment?
Well, once again, my mandate's very, very clear. It's economic return. All our investments are based on maximizing value, keeping our costs low, providing high-quality services. That's what we do, and that's mandate's very clear. Now, if you know, there's government-sponsored housing that's, you know, constructed, we could be involved in, but not as an economic, it'd have to be strictly on an economic return basis. So it's not, it can't be a social program.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Nielsen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have another question from Twitter user Greasy Salad. What exactly is the future plans of the Legacy Foundation in terms of protecting for the future and possible uncertainty? Certainly. What exactly is the future plans of the Legacy Foundation in terms of protecting for the future and possible uncertainty?
I will start. And you can certainly add, my colleagues from AIMCO can certainly add to my response. Certainly the financial markets always have uncertainty. If any of us could predict where the future lied, we'd invest in lottery tickets or something like that, because they pay off very well if you know the answer. We protect against future uncertainty through diversification, global diversification. We are invested in a number of different asset classes, you know, at a top level, equities, fixed income, and infrastructure and other alternative investments, inflation sensitive. But below that, we're invested geographically, different types of real estate, different types of companies, different types of debt securities from different parts of the world. You know, that, and you know, I would add that AIMCO uses state-of-the-art risk management systems as well to measure the risk of the fund and to do that. But there is no doubt that as we saw in 2008-9, the Heritage Fund will go through a year sometime in the future where it loses double digits, where its return is negative 10% or more. There's no doubt that is going to happen. But as we talked about earlier today, we're invested for the long term and not for 1 year periods. And when you do that, you have to experience some of the bad years to get the good years. And we have, you know, we have a fairly aggressive target, I think, of 5.5% plus inflation long term, and we have beat that over 10 years, which included a year where if my memory serves me, and Rod, you could correct me, we lost 18% in 2008-9. So the best way to protect against risk is to take that long-term view and not panic and sell out when the market bottoms out. So that's how, we're well diversified. We use risk systems to control our risk and to measure our risk, and we look to the long term. That's how we handle those risks.
Okay, thank you. Does any of our panel have any questions?
I have a question. As I understand it, AIMCO has been directed from the Minister of Finance to set aside 3% of the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund to go to specific types of Alberta companies. What category of companies are you directed to set aside the funds for?
Yes, you're of course referring to the Budget 2015 announcement.
Yes.
The relationship between AIMCO and the government is such that, as our client, there's a number of details that will dictate the parameters of that investable universe. At this point, we're still in discussions with Treasury Board and Finance to precisely define what that growth investable universe will be.
Okay, given that in the past, we've had governments try to pick winners and losers, or perhaps it would be better said to, direct the funds. Consequently, we ended up with companies like Gainers on the books. Those were solid losers. Should the government be directing AIMCO, given their past performance with investing? The past governments just frankly haven't done a great job when they've tried to direct funds.
The relationship between AIMCO and the government is such that, and our clients is such that our clients direct us from an asset class perspective. The examples that the committee member referenced were, of course, specific investment examples, and that was done under a different act, that was done under a different legislation for the Heritage Fund. Today, as we've been discussing, the Heritage Fund's mandate is maximize returns, and the instructions that we are discussing with Treasury Board and Finance is with respect to an asset class. The specific investments, similar to the ones you described, but we don't expect to be investing in similar results, but the specific investments will be made by AIMCO and chosen by AIMCO.
And I would just reiterate that the mandate has not changed. What drives our investment behavior is return. And so that's the key.
And, if I can add to that, from the department side, those discussions that Darren mentioned, we are involved in as well from the department side, and we would reiterate what they're saying. The primary screen, if you will, for investments is investment returns. It is not, this company benefits Albertans, hopefully we make a return. It is, does this company, or whatever it is, make a return, and then does it benefit Albertans? It's returns first and foremost. If it doesn't pass that screen, it doesn't go into the asset class.
Excellent. Yeah, that's the litmus test I think I would expect that you would have for that.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Mr.
The
App?
legislation gives us no alternative.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Ms. McKittrick.
I've been very impressed about the returns that you've been able to get for the fund, and some of the things that you discussed before around your carbon and water policies. I was just wondering, as you're making investment, if you have any other ethical or environmental screen in terms of deciding what investments to invest in.
So from the AIMCO terminology, it's what we refer to as responsible investing. Again, at the risk of belaboring this, but AIMCO's mandate is to maximize net risk-adjusted returns. But of course, as part of the investment process, when we are reviewing the investments that we're going to make, and in fact, reviewing the investments that we are maintaining, we certainly take into account environmental factors, social factors, and governance factors, for the reason being that, as I mentioned earlier, companies and assets that excel in those areas, that have good governance, that have processes, policies in place to address environmental issues, including climate change, are better investments and tie back to us succeeding in our core mandate.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Renaud.
It's okay, actually, my question was answered by Mr. Utt.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Sear.
So it was stated earlier that there's $8 billion invested in Alberta right now. Is that correct, from my understanding? So this is $8 billion over $90 billion in total. So we have 8 to 9% of our portfolio invested in Alberta right now? So this announcement in the budget to allocate 3% or 3% allocation to Alberta growth opportunities, does that mean we're going from 8 to 11, or does that mean we're going from 8 down to 3?
Certainly doesn't mean we're going from 8 to 3.
and it doesn't necessarily mean we're going from 8 to 11. The 8% that we're invested in is invested, and this is in the annual report on page 18, is primarily, the largest investment is real estate, Alberta real estate. But we also have, that's about 976 million. 300 million in equities, 250 million in fixed income, and so on. That's for the Heritage Fund. So 1.75 billion of the Heritage Fund is invested in Alberta. So is that going to go, is it 540 more? Well, it could be. It would allow for that. But what we've done with the asset allocation in the letter that the minister, or actually the deputy minister, sent to AIMCO to make this change to our policy is that will come from Canadian equities. Okay, we have an 8% allocation to Canadian equities right now within our target asset allocation. 50% total equities, 42 foreign, 8% Canadian. So we're going to drop that 8% Canadian to 5% Canadian. Total equities will be 47%. Now it is likely that that 3% will be equities as well. If you look at what the budget says, it's in Alberta growth opportunities. That sounds like companies' equities to me. So theoretically, the reduction in Canadian equities could come from Alberta companies or Ontario or Quebec. So, to be clear here, it might actually make no difference, this allocation of 3% in this fund that the budget has named out, saying that we're going to help Alberta companies. It is a change to the focus. It's Alberta growth companies. I don't think it's my place to make the comment whether or not it will have that impact. Sorry, Chair, I should be referring before I start every. So then it'd be AIMCO. Do we have an answer that this 3% that you're negotiating with the ministry, are we actually going to see any additional investment in Alberta? Because it looks to me like we're already at 8%. I guess if it's not going from 8 to 11, then it's misleading possibly that this number is coming from the budget?
If we could just go over the numbers a little bit. We're throwing a lot of numbers around. I mean, if I've got this right, Lowell will correct me if I'm wrong, about $1.7 billion in Alberta, and it's my understanding that the 3% represents another $535 million roughly, right? So I would just add that, this is still relatively new, and the details have not been worked out, and we plan on meeting with our partners at Alberta Treasury Board and Finance to figure out how this is going to be deployed and in what manner. There's still, some questions as to what growth is and, the timing of investing and what that represents. And, as I said earlier, AIMCO has $8 billion invested in Alberta. The Heritage Fund has $1.7 billion. And it's invested across a number of different asset classes, including, equities and infrastructure and real estate that has, I'm sure, contributed, to the economy and creating jobs, and that's a wonderful thing. But the details on this program are still being worked out and finalized. So I don't think we have all the answers to all the particulars just yet.
So is it possible for this allocation for us to end up with less Alberta investment?
If you look at our annual report against page 18, total investment in equities in Alberta right as of March 31st was $313 million. So if we sold every company, Alberta company, and I'm pretty sure AIMCO's not going to do that because there are very good Alberta companies traded publicly and privately. Even if we sold all of those, we put more back in. Right? I mean, simple numbers, right? 313 is the most we could sell, so.
But if we end up with 540 again, then we're only getting what like a 1% increase or a 1.5%, which is not what has been stated in the budget. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to understand this. So
Absolutely. Could it work out that way? I suppose it could, but not necessarily.
Thank you. That's the answer that I was hoping that we would get. So thank you.
Any more questions from the audience? Seeing none, Mr. Nielsen, any more questions?
Yes, Madam Chair, I have a question from email George Z. Why don't we lend money to Azerbaijan and other Central Asian countries? They are paying high returns on their bonds.
We assess all of our investments around the world on risk-adjusted returns. So while the yields on emerging market bonds might be higher, we have to assess the risk and also the liquidity of those investments. And at that time, we don't feel that that is the appropriate investment for the portfolio right now.
Thank you. Any more questions, Mr. Nielsen?
No, Madam Chair.
Okay, and none from the audience? Okay, seeing no more questions or comments, I will begin wrapping up our meeting. Before I close, I would like to sincerely thank all of you for your participation tonight. I think I can speak on behalf of the entire committee when I say that we have enjoyed spending the evening with you and engaging in conversation about your Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund. In turn, we hope you found the meeting informative and value. For those of you who would like to offer feedback on this evening's meeting, please go to www.assembly.ab.ca and answer our short survey. To our TV and online viewers, thanks so much for tuning in. And to those of you who made it here tonight, we really appreciate you taking the time to be here as part of our audience. A repeat broadcast of this meeting will air on Shaw Direct from 9 to 11 p.m. tonight and on Shaw TV Edmonton from 10 p.m. till midnight. More information about this committee and its mandate can be found at www.assembly.ab.ca/AB Heritage Trust Fund. This meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.